Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Exercise is Bullshit, which obviously stands for bodybuilding utilizing logical lifting and scientific heuristics to inform training. As our next guest, James Steele, Dr. James Steele will know, formerly the king of statistics at Solent University in Southampton. He is now with Kaiser in Australia. And James, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your new role, a little bit of your history, and how did you get started in this new project?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Logan. And that's the first time I'm hearing the full explanation of the acronym. So
The
you
acronym,
reeled that
yeah?
off so fluently. That was beautiful.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah, so I guess a bit of background for anyone listening is, I was an academic at Solent University, associate professor of sport and exercise science for almost a decade. And recently made the shift now working in industry with Kaiser Australia. So for anyone who's not familiar, Kaiser is a company based out of Europe, but they've got a large network of clinics in Australia now. And they provide essentially high intensity resistance strength training, typical kind of like low volume hit style training. But unlike a lot of kind of typical kind of HIIT facilities, they are, particularly in Australia, very much situated in a more medical space. So we work with a lot of clinical populations. All clinics have physiotherapists, exercise physiologists who work specifically with these clinical populations as well. So it's a really exciting new role for me. I'm their new head of research. We're just starting to really establish kind of a good infrastructure for delivering research and contributing to the evidence base around resistance exercise and health. I'm really excited to be working with them. So that's the brief kind of background.
No, that's great. And for any of our listeners who aren't familiar with Kaiser, I would definitely recommend looking them up, specifically the Australian version. If you're into high-end strength training equipment, they basically, if correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a while since I've taught Kaiser, but I think they bought the rights to Medex essentially, and then they basically have recreated it themselves in a Swiss facility. And so you walk into a Kaiser clinic, which I've never been to in person, but I've seen the videos and pictures and stuff, and it's like you're in Jim Flanagan's house. I mean, it's like brand new vintage Medex equipment. And they did a really cool thing, I thought, and maybe you know a little bit more about this now that you've been there now, that they actually like it's almost like Nautilus and Medex had a baby because they have like a multi machine there. They have a cat. They have tons of stuff that Medex actually never made, but they've kind of created their own, Frankenstein versions that look pretty freaking awesome. What was it, before this is totally off topic, but before we transition into that, now that you're there, what was kind of the impetus for that? Like, when did they start making sort of their own designs on some of that stuff?
I mean, it's interesting because so Kaiser Europe have had a research department for some time and an engineering department, but a lot of the research that they do is not kind of the research that I do. A lot of it is more focused on the technology development and so machine development, and so they're constantly. Ever since Werner Kieser's old gyms had all Nautilus equipment with it, and then when Arthur set up the rights to be able to produce them in Europe were kind of exchanged, and ever since then, Werner's had Werner's obviously passed away now, but Kieser have used what were Medex equipment, rebranded it, and most of the equipment has been. There will be subtle changes that anyone who's like a real Medex aficionado will notice the differences. And you'll see that, like you say, there are certain lines of equipment where they've gone, we don't have something to train that. And so we need to develop a new piece of equipment for that. Or over time, with use, you start to realize that some of this equipment is, you can't necessarily put it up on a pedestal. There are flaws and things like that need to be addressed. So Kaiser have been really, they're continually developing. So one of the things that I've been privy to is that they are currently essentially redeveloping and re-engineering the old Medex medical knee extension. Because that's currently no longer produced. So Kaiser still produce the medical lumbar extension and the medical cervical extension. but the knee extension is not used, and they're currently re-engineering it to address some of the big limitations for that piece of equipment had, particularly from a strength testing perspective. And so so hopefully soon we'll be seeing some of those re-enter the Kaiser clinics as well, which will be cool.
That's pretty cool. I don't wish for Keyser to ever close. I want you to be successful in your job, but if they ever did, there would be a really cool aftermarket market of not Nautilus, not Medex, this Swiss kind of Frankenstein stuff. That's awesome. But yeah, if anybody ever has the chance to look at their stuff, it's very, very cool. And you'll see pieces and be like, that's a Nautilus piece, but they've completely redone it and it's got plates on it. Okay, so as far as your research goes and your role at Keyser, is everything you're going to be doing from a research perspective, is that meant for internal use, or are you guys trying to contribute to sort of the broader exercise science community from a research perspective? What is your kind of focus with the sort of research you'll be doing? Because like you mentioned, it is more of a clinical facility. So is it going to be hypertrophy research? Is it going to be rehabilitation? Like what is kind of the focus? And I'm sure that will change over the years.
Yeah, so I mean, we are part of the reason for investment in research at the moment from Keyser's kind of perspective is there's a reputational aspect to it as well, and we do want to essentially contribute to the broader evidence base about the value of resistance exercise. And so, we will be, there's a number of projects we're working on, and I'll mention some of them in a moment. And the aim of them is not necessarily solely for internal use. Of course, they have strong evidence around the benefits of resistance training has business implications for a company that provides services that include resistance exercise and strength training. So there is obviously always kind of like
just acknowledge your biases and you'll be fine.
Absolutely, no, like I get paid for to do this, but also I should note as well, for those who don't know, I'm a very big proponent of openness and transparency in the research that I do. Keyser are fully supportive of that. So all of the work that we're doing, we're going to be really pushing forwards with some of the methods reforms in terms of pre-registration, open data, materials and things like that. So all the biases acknowledged and deliberately putting things in place to try and hold us accountable to those. But yeah, so we there's a mix of things really. I've got some like kind of big ticket projects that I'm working on, but there's also kind of smaller projects that are maybe a little bit more focused on for example, elements of the exercise protocol or our kind of standard operating procedures regarding how our exercise scientists work with members. So I'll give you an example. So the first research project that we've just, which is a little bit more internally focused, was specifically around the role of supervision in training, which colleague James Fisher is a big area of interest of his at the moment. But actually, this is a project we did with Keyser like 7 years ago. We did a small kind of acute randomized crossover trial. So Keyser has two primary types of members. They have core members who are introduced to the Keyser method. They get given their training protocol, and then they can come into a facility and they can train on their own. And then they'll have a review session typically every 3 months. Or they can be an assisted member, which is they come in and they either train once or twice a week under the supervision of one of our qualified exercise scientists. And it was interesting because we did this randomized crossover trial literally 6-7 years ago now, where we took a group of core members and in a randomized fashion we had them perform their current workouts using their current loads. Told it's a study, you've got to go to failure. Looked at their time under load performance, rating of perceived effort, discomfort as well, and then had them in randomized order either do that unsupervised or supervised to look at the kind of acute effects of that. But and we never got round to finishing up the study and actually getting it written up. And so obviously when I came into Keyser, I was like, do you know what? We've actually got a study that we did a few years back in collaboration with Keyser. And what prompted me to go back and look at it was I now obviously have access to all of our data, and when I was out in Australia in October, a number of the exercise scientists that I interact with would always comment on the fact that They think that the core trainees are definitely not training to a high enough intensity of effort. So Keyser uses a typical kind of single set to failure protocol, but they use a time under load target range. So instead of like a rep based double progression where you pick a load that you fail at 8 to 12 reps, and then if you do more than 12 reps before you reach failure, up the load, and so on. They use a time under load based target of 90 to 120
Is it
seconds time under
90?
load.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Yeah. But
Are
what
they
they
moving
think is
super slow typically?
it's
Or
not
like
super slow.
5
It's like
5 to 10
it's
10 kind of thing?
4-4 with a kind of
4 4.
2-second pause uh,
Gotcha.
under tension at either end of the range of motion. But yeah, a lot of the trainers said like, we're convinced that so many of the core trainees, they're not using heavy enough loads. They train, they hit 120, and then they stop, and they're miles away from failure. So I went and pulled out a sample of the data, pulled out like a random sample of 1,000 members, and just looked at the distribution of time under loads that we've got for all of their workouts. And you see this wonderful kind of like distribution that hits like 120 and then goes boom. And there's like a spike of like people who are just stopping bang on 120. But interestingly, what we see as well, and this is why this study was really interesting from an internal perspective, because it let us kind of look at the quality of what we're doing internally. Because actually, I then pulled out a random sample of 1,000 sessions that were done under supervision, so from our assisted members, and the distribution looks exactly the same. So it looked as though, like the under the supervised sessions, a lot of the time our members are kind of they're
They're
getting
faking
away with
failure.
murder. Yeah. Or the trainers might not be quite pushing them as hard as they could. And now,
Pushing them.
that
Yeah.
might be because we're working with clinical populations, and there's a little bit of kind of fear with doing that. But it was really interesting because I presented those results back, and we've pre-printed the paper, which describes both the kind of historical data and then the randomized study that we did. Because in the study context, you do see that there is a positive benefit of supervision. And so we've got this kind of comparison of what happens in a study versus what happens just out in the real world. But presenting it back, like the interesting experience I had stepping from kind of an academic background into now working in industry with a company that wants to improve the quality of the services it's providing and try and, always kind of, improve what they're doing. And the reaction to it was, wow, this is super interesting. How do we start to address this? How do we start to improve this? And what are the kind of things we can put in place? So this has been really, that data has been useful though, because we've been able to use it internally and then question like, okay, so now what do we do to try and improve the processes of, we've got a particular protocol that should be being delivered because that's a fairly standardized procedure across clinics. What can we now do to try and implement interventions to ensure that members are training as hard as they should be?
So that does make me think of something though. While you were off on that tangent, and maybe if I talk for a minute, your internet will stay good. When the last time I talked with somebody from Keyser was Tim Detman, who was, I think, their CMO. I can't remember what his title was. He's since moved on from there. But one of the things they had talked about, and it got me thinking of this as you were talking about supervision, is I think you and Fisher had done that paper a few years back where it was the survey where you were looking at people who think they need supervision and whether or not people who train or are trainers think that they need supervision. Is that something that, at the time Tim had talked about, oh man, we should probably start having our trainers train with other people. Is that something that shifted at Keyser? Like, do they have their trainers train with trainers? Or is it still kind of like, do as I say, not as I do?
No, they definitely do. So they have team training like once a week. So Tuesdays, essentially, there is like a blocked out period where all of the team kind of partner up and train. But that was an interesting experience for me being there as well. So like I when I was in our South Melbourne clinic, our national clinic support, which is kind of like our head office, I joined in with team training, and actually when I was there recently, instead of partnering up, I like floated around the floor and intervened on like everyone's workout, and took like for at least every person, like I was able to step in and be like and probably up their loads by like 25-30%, and still, oh man, what is going on? Fuck.
It's better. It's better. I don't know. It's just, we'll just go. It uploads.
Okay.
So you were
Yeah,
increasing
man, this is
increasing their loads by 20 or 30%?
yeah, and still managing to get them to push past achieve failure past the 1/22nd target as well, which is a real eye opener for a lot of them as well, because they're like, oh shit, like we're not training as hard as we think we are.
Yeah.
So yeah, so there's been it's caused a bit of a lot of reflection and discussion, and we're really starting to think about, from a trainer training perspective, how do we make sure that like they know what the experience of like training hard actually should look like, and feel like, and then they're better able to convey that to our members. And we're starting to think a bit more carefully about the language we use with the members, because the terminology of like failure, particularly for like a clinical population, is like a scary term. So we're really trying to shift more towards using effort rather than failure, and trying to think about those sorts of things. So yeah, so there's research that we're doing that's focused internally, but there's also, and will be of interest to a wider kind of like community that work in resistance exercise as well. But some of the other kind of like broader projects that I'm working on at the moment are, we have a lot of strong partnerships with health insurers in Australia, who essentially fund their members who have been diagnosed with hip or knee osteoarthritis or spinal problems. And have been referred for surgery and told that if they don't do something, like in the next 3 years, they'll be having to go under the knife and have surgery. Instead, their insurers will pay for them to come and do a strengthening program at Keyser. So they'll have physiotherapy, they'll have strength training. And so we've had, 1,500 plus patients come through these programs now. And so one of the big focuses for me is essentially a big retrospective kind of evaluation of the effectiveness of these programs.
Kind of progress they've seen, so that you
yeah,
can
both in
present
terms of
that
kind
to
of
the
functional
insurance
outcomes.
companies. Yeah.
Yeah, so functional outcomes, pain, disability, and patient-reported outcomes like that. But also, one of the things we're trying to do as well is link up with Australia's great. They've got one of the world-leading registries for joint replacement surgeries that have happened, and so that's a really key resource. And we're currently exploring how we can link our data to that, so we can follow up patients over time and understand, like, did we delay their surgery? And we've got a small sample of just over 100 patients that we've been able to follow up for 5 years post intervention. And considering they were told they would have surgery within the next 3 years, at 5 years, we're seeing 75% of them have still managed to avoid surgery at that point.
That's great.
So there's that. One project which I think will be super interesting to a lot of listeners is we're starting to look at members or patients who are undergoing GLP-1 receptor agonist medications.
Yeah.
So what we're starting to see, and there was a recent meta-analysis of the trials that we do have of GLP-1 RA treatments, that approximately 30% of the weight loss that occurs seems to be lean mass loss. And that's not necessarily muscle loss, that's bone and potentially other organ tissue as well. But it's not all fat loss that's occurring. And the sorts of magnitudes of lean mass loss that seem to be occurring are not dissimilar from what you see in kind of like extreme caloric restriction studies as well. Yeah. So obviously the thinking is, well, in those kinds of energy deficit studies, you can mitigate the amount of lean mass loss that occurs by participating in resistance training whilst you're also undergoing energy deficit. And so what we're looking to now explore is, we've got kind of two phases to the work that we're doing. We know that quite a lot of our members are on GLP-1 receptor agonists. So to start off with, considering we capture strength data, we also capture from a large portion of members' body composition data regularly using BIA. And we obviously have all their workout data as well. We're about to launch a big survey of our membership to try and understand who is on these medications. And then once we've been able to understand who's on the medications and when they have been on them and for what duration, we'll be able to go back into our data and pull out essentially kind of like the period before they went on them and the period after they went on them, to look at strength outcomes as a kind of proxy for, well, if they're losing lean mass and that's muscle, then we might expect some strength losses. And also for those who we've got body composition data for, we'll be able to look and see, like, to what extent has the lean mass loss over that period been mitigated as well. and then the hope is what we're going to be doing is moving towards a clinical trial at some point as well, where we'll actually do like an RCT of incoming patients who we know are. We've got a number of relationships with endocrinology clinics, and so we'll be looking to hopefully get some funding to set up something prospective. So, like, as patients are going to go onto the medications, they will be
To
randomized to potentially
recruit
come in,
them. Yeah.
and either do
Yeah.
or not do that.
I would love to see something like that in the States at some point, and that would probably be a great first step because that's my biggest fear with those drugs. Like when they first came out, I was very anti just put in the work fatty, and I've very much changed my opinion on that, and I think they can be really powerful. It just worries me that we're opening ourselves up to it if people are just taking them and sitting on the couch, right? Which seems to be what probably the majority of people are actually doing. Nobody's at. So I would love to see something to the effect of you can have Ozempic, but you also have to have a membership to a gym with it. And if you don't check in at least 3 times per week, you don't get your next shot, kind of thing. Now we're probably a little ways off from that because they're going to make all their money first, but hopefully in the future, they want to put as few restriction on it as possible. But I would love to see something like that in the future because I think they can make a huge difference in people's lives. And obviously, it's easy to say, oh, you're overweight, just work out, eat better. But I think a lot of people, and if you talk to your members that are going through this, it's like it can be so disheartening not to see the numbers change on the scale. So to just have that scale victory first can really motivate people. Where if you're internally motivated, you might just be able to say, you know what? Do you know who Ethan Suplee is? Yeah, the big actor that lost like 300 pounds. Yeah. So like he's the type of guy, right? Just do it, fatty. Like we're gonna do this every day. Or David Goggins, perfect example. Like super intrinsically motivated. But a lot of people need that outside motivation. They need that outside victory in order to actually motivate themselves to do anything. So I think there's a lot of great application for those in the future. But I'm super interested to see that, especially if you can start recruiting some people for an RCT. Now, in something like that, would you have a control group? I feel like that would be kind of what's the word where it's like you can't do it because it's mean.
So I think what we would probably end up exploring is essentially the addition of resistance training to GLP-1 receptor agonist.
So it would just be not doing it versus
doing it. Yeah, because I think the question is, can we mitigate the lean mass loss that occurs?
Yeah,
it is interesting though because when you like, I was thinking as you were saying, do we an approach might be, you have a whole kind of holistic approach to taking the medications, being physically active, addressing diet and whatnot as well. Actually, commercially, a lot of the organizations, a lot of the companies that provide these medications, they don't sell the medications. They sell like a kind of wellness package kind of thing, which is like, you get physical activity advice and other coaching and health coaching and bits and bobs as well. So it's interesting to see. And I think also we're not necessarily, it's still probably not clear to what extent the contributing factors are of that kind of like multi-component intervention alongside the medications are. But I mean, you don't need to be a genius to predict that most people probably aren't following the behavioral components of it quite as strictly as they could be, given how hard it is to get just anyone to be active. But yeah, no, that's going to be it's going to be an interesting area. It's obviously like a very hot, sexy topic at the moment. Actually approached by Professor Rob Daly and David Scott at Deakin University, who were interested in collaborating with us around this area, and so we're going to be pursuing that with them.
Well, that's awesome. Okay, well, what I actually wanted to talk to you about today was your paper on machine-based resistance training and how it improves functional capacity in older adults. So do we have time to go into that? Do you have 30 more minutes, or do you have a hard stop?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah?
No, yeah,
okay.
I'm pretty free.
Perfect. So before we go into that, one of the things I always like to ask is, what is something in the last 3 to 5 years that you've taken a big 180 on in your own personal belief system that you used to think 100% this is the way? Obviously, for those of you who don't know, James is really big into ice baths. He does like 3 every morning. So have you changed your mind on that? No, but in all seriousness, is there something that, 3 to 5 years ago, you were pretty certain this is the way things have to be in order to reach X outcome, that maybe you've let being the data statistician connoisseur that you are, that you've kind of come around to realize that maybe it's not so important?
It's a very good question. Um, hmm. So I do have an answer for that, but it's probably it's quite niche, and it's much more kind of re- focused at research and focused at researchers and the way research is being done. So
Okay.
I was talking with one of my previous PhD students about this recently. One of the things that researchers often try to emphasize in our field is something called like external validity or ecological validity. So they want to try and there's been a real push and emphasis over time to have studies better reflect what's going on out in the real world. So studies being conducted in facilities out there where people are
This study
training.
doesn't matter because it was only 18 to 21-year-old college students. Yeah. Like, what does that have to
Yeah,
do with
yeah,
me? That
and
kind
they
of stuff.
trained
Yeah.
in a lab, and they had like free researchers stood around them and stuff like that. But I think recently, like I've much more clearly kind of come around to the idea that like it's not necessarily the results of the study themselves that are generalizable, because that's I mean, you just can go back to like basic college logic. Everyone know like it's inductive logic generalization from kind of the particulars of a particular study like always have limitations. Like if that's your approach to doing things, then you have to do the study in every possible which way, population, tweaks of the training variables and everything to get any kind of like generalizable knowledge. What is more generalizable is the theories that you try to test with those studies. And I think our sport and exercise science is a young field still, relatively speaking, and not many fields do this. But I think a shift towards much more clear kind of like development of kind of theories of training that generate predictions we can actually go test in studies well is probably the thing where like 5 years ago I was like yeah, we should be really focusing on like real world studies and things like that, whereas actually I think I'm shifting a lot more in the other direction and kind of saying we should be coming up with strong theories and predictions and then going out and designing studies that can test those. And sometimes those studies will be real world based, and sometimes those studies will be much more kind of tightly controlled lab based conditions that still test the theory that we're interested in.
That's a super interesting answer, and I wouldn't expect anything less from you. Let's dive into this paper now. This was a few months back. This was end of 2024, maybe, when this one came out, something like that.
Yeah.
But I found it super interesting. So again, the title for anybody interested in looking it up, and I'll link it in the description as well, is "Machine-Based Resistance Training Improves Functional Capacity in Older Adults: A Systemic Review and Meta-Analysis." Talk to me a little bit about what was the impetus for this paper? How did it kind of come together? And then, putting this idea together of functional training versus machine training, right? Because we hear that word thrown around all the time: functional capacity, functional training. You have to train for function as you get older. But what does that really mean?
Yeah, sure. So actually, this project was lead author was Archie Kirk, who was one of our previous students at Solent University on the undergraduate program in sports science. He's now actually finishing up his master's still at Solent as well. And it's funny actually. So originally, this started as an undergraduate dissertation project that Archie wanted to pursue, and Dr. Fisher was supervising that. But inevitably, I ran the dissertation project at module at Solent, so I would often have tutorials of the students and give them kind of methodological input and advice and things. And then when Archie came to me with this, I kind of took a look over it and I said, this could actually be done maybe a bit more robustly than you're planning to do just for your dissertation project. So I kind of came in and pointed out that we could actually do a meta-analysis here. We could actually, rather than just qualitatively, kind of as he was planning on doing, appraise the studies, one by one, which is a weak method of evidence synthesis nowadays, given the developments that we have in much more advanced statistical approaches to synthesizing evidence across these kinds of studies. And so, yeah, so I kind of stepped in, got involved. Fisher and Archie were obviously very interested from a substantive perspective on the question. I was interested in it as well, but also it was a cool opportunity to do some fun what we call kind of like ARM-based network meta-analyses approaches, which are relatively new for looking at these kinds of things. But yeah, the broader substantive area is interesting because, like, for years, people have argued that a problem with machine-based training is it's not quote unquote functional, and there's the movements are too constrained to a particular plane of motion or whatever. There's not the degrees of freedom you would get in a typical kind of movement that's performed using a free weight or something like that. And so you can better replicate kind of quote unquote functional movement patterns using free weights and other approaches. Whereas machines, while they might build some strength and some muscle mass, they're not going to improve your functional ability to perform other tasks. Which, to be fair, like, it's surprising that this is one of those myths that's been around for a long time, and I think we have quite a lot of data now that really does show that the most specific transfers to any kind of specific movement or task come from practicing the actual task, and so any contributions that, like, so unless your unless your task is like whatever a free weight 1RM squat, then performing squats versus performing a leg press isn't necessarily going to improve your sit to stand better than anything else under well-controlled comparisons. But some people have questioned whether or not you can even get any kind of functional improvements in kind of typical activities of daily living, particularly in older populations, which these outcomes are typically explored in. One of the biggest issues with aging is frailty. And, once people get to that point where they're not independently capable of getting themselves up off the chair and taking themselves to the toilet in time, like the severe impact on their quality of life. Obviously, as well, we've argued that for that kind of population, a machine-based training protocol is probably more feasible and acceptable and probably safer for them as well. I mean, you don't even need to, be a genius to think that look at the data and say, like, well, okay, for a young population who are training sensibly and not being morons in the gym, the injury rates between training with free weights versus machines are negligible. But the reality is you can't drop a machine on yourself, but you can drop a barbell on yourself. And all of the data we have from sort of like emergency room visits and things like that show that the highest proportion of injuries come from people basically dropping free weights on themselves, which could be something that an older adult could quite easily do and cause a break and cause all sorts of mischief to themselves. So we've argued before that a machine-based protocols are better for those kinds of populations. And I should, I'll add that obviously, like, our typical membership at Keyser are typically an older population. I think our mean age is something like 55. So they are shifting towards that older population and typically more clinical. But yeah, so we wanted to, Archie and Fisher systematically reviewed the literature and identified studies that had looked at a typical kind of outcome, which is considered to be a measurement of kind of functional capacity in older adult populations.
So can you talk a little bit about what those functional capacity tests look like? Because I think you hear functional training and a lot of people think sport-specific movement. But obviously, as you're an older individual, what are the things, the activities of daily living that you're trying to accomplish? So what are the types of tests you were looking for in this paper for functional capacity?
Yeah, so there's a number of different ones that you can use. Like there are batteries of tests that are typically used, but they often consist of similar kinds of measurements. So we focus specifically on timed up and go, which is essentially a test that involves the individual getting up, traveling a particular distance, and how long it takes them to do that. and then also a sit to stand based tests, because for older adults, like just getting out of a chair is something that can be difficult for them. So these are typically kind of like standard outcome measures that are used for kind of functional capacity, or that reflect activities of daily living, basically being able to get up and move. There are other ones as well which are used in the literature, but for this specifically, we focused on those outcomes.
So before we get into the kind of the dumbed down version of the analytics, because you're obviously like the king of stats, this paper in particular made me think of, something I always try to communicate to individuals, which is when it comes to sport specific training, functional training, whatever it is, like you don't look at the causality line from younger, more athletic populations and how it transfers to older people. Like the causality does not move that way. It can and usually does move the opposite way, meaning like just because LeBron James can stand on a Bosu ball doing a 300-pound one-legged squat does not mean that that's what your grandma should be doing. But if your grandma can get good results from doing a leg press, that is also going to work for a younger population, right? So the flow doesn't necessarily move from the athletic population to the older population, but it almost always moves from older down to younger. Now, younger people, more athletic people can obviously get away with more, but that doesn't mean you can apply those things to somebody who's less mobile, who's older, who doesn't have experience, who's not athletic, right? So I thought this was just a great paper to really explain functional capacity of like, if this works for an older population, it's 100% going to work for a younger population. Does that mean it's the best thing for them to do? Maybe, maybe not, but it's going to work where, vice versa, you don't necessarily see that same causality. So that was the cool thing for me. Now, as far as the papers you were looking at, how did you kind of analyze this? Give me the dumbing down version of that.
So in terms of the papers that got included, they had to have included a resistance training intervention that was performed using resistance machines, so selectorized machines or plate-loaded machines, but essentially not free weights or other resistance modalities. And they had to have measured functional capacity in older adults as an outcome. Now, when we reviewed, or when Archie and James reviewed the literature and looked at that, there are a range of studies, some of which include a control population, group, so a group that did not train. And typically, when in terms of being able to determine causality for an intervention, you ideally want to have a trial where you randomize to either control or placebo or whatever it is, depending upon the type of intervention you're looking at and the intervention itself. And so some of the studies had those control groups, and some of them didn't though. But what we're able to do with more kind of like modern meta-analysis methods is essentially be able to kind of draw power across those studies statistically to be able to kind of estimate what the effects of the intervention are, even in the studies that don't have the control groups, by kind of leveraging information from the studies where they do have control groups about what the difference between the populations actually is. I mean, one of the benefits we do actually have with resistance exercise is that typically you tend to see similar magnitudes of effects, particularly for outcomes like strength and muscle mass. And I would suspect so for anything that's not like a subjectively reported outcome anyway. Similar magnitudes of effects in randomized controlled trial comparisons and typical just pre-post kind of single arm comparisons as well. Whereas typically for a lot of other clinical areas of research, that is not the case. And that's why randomized controlled trials are so important for looking at certain outcomes. But we're quite lucky in resistance exercise that we can still leverage information from those single arm studies, or studies where they may have like a resistance machine group versus a free weight group, whatever. So we were able to apply these kind of Bayesian arm-based network models and leverage that information across those studies to estimate like what is the typical kind of change in a control group, and then what is the typical change after doing a resistance training intervention using machines, and then get what the kind of standardized mean change is then for the training effects.
Were you able to compare that to other studies that had used maybe more traditional, like functional training exercises? Like, was that the standard you were looking for to see if it was at least as good as, say, free weights or dumbbells kind of thing? Or was it just this study on its own? We want to see what kind of improvements you can get from just doing a machine-based training.
Yeah, it was the latter, and part of the reason for that, and part of the reason why I gave a bit of the background to the project as well, is because it was an undergraduate dissertation project as well. We discussed whether we should expand it further and essentially start to bring in different kinds of resistance training modalities to draw those comparisons. But just in terms of the scope of the project for the nature of what it was, we decided to keep it limited to just because people have kind of questioned whether you can make functional improvements from training with machines. It was an interesting question to just say,
Yeah,
well, let's see if you can.
let's see.
I don't do these functional
That poor
outcomes
kid
improve?
was probably like, "Man, I just wanted to write a paper. Do we have to do?"
Well, fortunately for him, he didn't have to do the analysis. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I guess in terms of the results, I can kind of touch on those. I'll very briefly touch on the actual strength outcomes first as well, because we did look at the strength outcomes. And the magnitudes of change that we see for strength are typically kind of within the range of expectations we would expect just from any kind of resistance training intervention. So they do provide us a little bit of a comparison in the sense that I've worked with a number of very large-scale meta-analysis data sets nowadays. So one of the big ones that I've worked on is well over 100 studies, all randomized controlled trials. Of a variety of different kinds of resistance training interventions, some machine-based, some free weight-based, varying sets, loads, volumes, etc., etc. All of which only make very, very minimal difference to the outcomes. But the typical let me just quickly explain this in case listeners are not familiar with the terminology, but we looked at what are called standardized effect sizes. And so these are expressed in standard deviation units. So if you imagine all of these studies will have measured strength, maybe using different methods. So some might have used a 1 repetition maximum. So they'll have reported the results in kilograms in whatever exercise they've tested that in. Some might have used isometric strength, and they might report it in Newton meters for a particular dynamometer that they've used. So what we do is we standardize all of these effects by saying, okay, what's the distribution of strength measured that way in that study? What are the standard deviation units of it? And then we standardize the change in strength to be expressed in standard deviation units. So that way we can combine them all. And this is a standard approach in meta-analyses that includes studies with different ways of measuring the outcome you're interested in. So in these big meta-analyses, what we typically see is and this is primarily in also healthy young populations, is that you see about a 0.89 standardized mean change in strength after a 12-week or so intervention. And what we see in this population, we saw a change of about 0.61. But the interval estimate of that was up to 1.01 as well. So the estimates are kind of in line. The magnitude of strength changes that we're seeing are in line with what we would expect from large-scale analysis of data and meta-analytic data sets. They also are fairly in line with what we've seen in, for example, I can't remember if we spoke before about the Fit20 study that I was involved in. So this is data from 15,000 people over 7 years or so. And if you look at the standardized mean changes over that first 12 weeks, again, they range from sort of like 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9. So they're all in that kind of ballpark. So that's encouraging to think that you're still seeing a magnitude of improvement in strength that's in line with what you see from various other kinds of resistance training interventions. But for the functional outcomes specifically as well, we obviously don't have that direct comparison. But we actually, again, saw a similar magnitude of change as a standardized outcome of about 0.63 for those outcomes as well. So there's definitely an improvement in these functional outcomes from participation in a machine-based training program.
Yeah, and that's got to be especially encouraging, now at Keyser too, right? Where you're doing completely machine-based training, where somebody who may be coming in from a PT in the past, where they've had a hip injury or a shoulder injury, and somebody's got them on a Kaiser. Is that also Keyser? Spelled the same? different pronunciation, I think. Like
Kaiser, the pneumatic ones.
yeah,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
pneumatic
That's
things, right?
Kaiser.
So they're doing all
Yeah,
kind of yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So to see like, oh well, my old PT had me standing one legged and tapping my nose and throwing a kettlebell over my head, to actually go, oh, actually no, we know the changes are going to be at least the same, and your risk of injury is probably significantly lower if you're doing this machine based training. I would imagine anybody, especially in a rehab setting, is like, oh yeah, let's get the lowest risk of injury possible, as long as my outcomes are going to be the same. Like, what is your ROI at the end compared to your risk analysis, right? Like, if there's a little more risk, but I'm going to get 3 times the results doing the functional training, yeah, maybe I do that. But if it's pretty much identical and your risk is significantly lower, why wouldn't you do a machine-based training program? And there was a quote that I dragged out of there too that I really liked, which was, "We believe this data adds to our understanding of training specificity and application of strength, and posit that any recommendation to train a movement rather than a muscle might be unnecessary." I love that, because all you hear in the functional training space is train the movement, train the movement. You got to get stronger at the movement. And like you said, very early on in this conversation, we've known for a long time, 20, 30 years, that specific movements require specific practice, right? You can't just overload a baseball bat and expect to swing faster. You can't, use a weighted basketball and expect to shoot further threes, right? Like, you can train your shoulder muscles and your forearm flexors and you'll be able to shoot the ball farther. Now you have to work on the accuracy through the specifics of that movement, but you can't just shoot a 10-pound basketball and expect to all of a sudden be Steph Curry. It just doesn't work that way, unfortunately, right? Because it'd be nice if it did. So how should trainers and trainees think about this in their workouts when they're maybe programming for someone who is trying to improve functional capacity, whether it be their grandma or, a young athlete? What are your thoughts on that?
The way I always think about it is, I have fairly simplistic kind of recommendations around things. I always kind of start with, look, do you have specific tasks that you need to improve your skill and performance at? Well, then you need to do those tasks. And for some populations, that might be tasks that they can incorporate into their resistance training program. Like powerlifters have got to do squat, bench, and deadlift. So unsurprisingly, you may as well squat, bench, and deadlift. But grandma, unless she's powerlifting, doesn't need to do those exercises. What she does need to do is get stronger, and then just be able to do the activity, practice getting up and out of her chair as she starts to develop the strength that she can clearly develop just using, like a leg press or some other kind of much lower risk exercise for modality for her. So my general kind of approach is to think like, look, if you have a client in front of you whose general goal is they want to just get stronger, generally speaking, then we're not necessarily saying you should use machines, but what it means is that you've got a big toolbox of options that you can choose from in terms of modalities to implement a resistance exercise intervention that will get that person stronger. And you might then decide that, okay, there's other considerations I need to take into account. I want it to be lower risk. Okay, I don't want them dropping weights on themselves. There's a lot of online coaching and stuff now, and you're not there to supervise them necessarily. So maybe you think about your programming in such a way that you say, right, I'm not going to be there to shadow you and make sure you don't injure yourself. So I'm going to give you a safe set of exercises I know you can do with minimal risk. Or, you might be working with a client who likes variety and will get bored if they're just sat on the same, bunch of machines all the time. And so you think, well, I mean, they still just want to get stronger, but they will get bored if I don't vary things up. So you can think about whether or not it's, when and where it's appropriate to do so. But I think this kind of ties back into like a theme of a lot of our work. And it kind of ties back into the point I made about the generalizability of theory, is that, by and large, most things work to roughly the same sort of degree. And any differences that may exist between different approaches are typically incredibly small. And none of our studies are designed to be able to actually reliably detect those. So the whole dueling studies thing is a largely boring exercise to me nowadays. But because we generally know that you start training, you get stronger, you grow muscle, you improve your function, and then you will eventually start to plateau, and that's fine. That's just life and reality, it suddenly opens up the toolbox to be able to say, look, within a set of boundaries of do it consistently, do it regularly, train fairly hard. You can improve these outcomes. If you've got specific outcomes, then think about how do you cater towards those. But generally, the template is pretty simple.
Yeah, and that makes me think too, just as well as, you had the point earlier, and that's one of my favorite things to say to people when it comes to machines versus dumbbells is you can't drop a machine on your head. And when I think to, the practicality of programming, like, yeah, it's great if you can do a 500-pound squat, but if you're a young individual and you're in the gym and you're trying to maximize the strength in your legs, is it worth the risk, especially in a larger strength and conditioning program where you can't have a coach there on you all the time, to have some meathead 18-year-old that has two buddies help him load his weight off the bar, and all of a sudden it's let's just hope and pray that he can get that thing up off the bottom. I've seen way too many YouTube videos of guys that are in really good shape but just let their ego get the best of them, dropping a barbell on their neck, falling forward with 400 pounds on a squat bar and, basically paralyzing themselves from the neck down. Like, what's the worst that happens if you load 480 pounds on a MedX leg press and you can't move it? Well, you can't move it. That's it. Like, that's it. Nothing else happens. So,
Yeah.
to me, from a safety perspective, especially as you move up through the ranks of athletics, it's similar to how I feel like people should protect themselves when it comes to as they get older, right? Like when you're Patrick Mahomes, you don't want to do anything to risk ruining your career. So I would avoid barbells and dumbbells like they were the plague. It maybe for certain specific movements that are required from like a rehabilitation perspective or something, obviously that's different. But for your main strength training, I wouldn't go anywhere near a barbell because I've got, $50 million a year riding on it. And the same thing could be said for a 75-year-old that, maybe is higher risk for breaking a hip or something. Why is it dangerous? For most people, no. But why risk it when you know that the risk is essentially zero when you're using machines? So that was just super interesting to me too. Do you think there's anything in your mind from a research perspective, though, that could ever persuade top S&C coaches to stop doing stupid shit, or are they just beyond saving?
I think there's a lot of people who are beyond saving, to be honest, and I've become fairly sort of like somewhat Buddhist over time, and just like they're having fun. They're not hurting anyone other than themselves. Then
and
they can crack on with that. I think it's funny. I've got a little bit of I like that you kind of brought it back a little bit to the sport application as well, and I think the same can be said in the older adults as well. It's like the rule number one is don't break your athlete. Like if you're a coach, and if the purpose of the strength and conditioning is to make them stronger and more resilient and perform better on the field, then don't break them before they get on the field. But also as well in in older populations, the risk of ending up in hospital because of a hip fracture or something like that is incredible. Just in terms of the risk of picking up infections. Like most older adults, once they've had that kind of once they've had a fall and they have a fracture or something like that, it's a sentence that they don't want to get really. So if that's caused by the thing that's supposed to be preventing that, then you're doing something wrong. But yeah, I've got a bit of a kind of like sociological theory somewhat around dumb stuff that happens in sports science as well. Actually, I wrote a book chapter called "The Myth of Periodization" that was published recently, and I think there's a bit in there that I talk about like the mythos of the kind of like Eastern Bloc success and things like that. And it's very, very hard to kind of like for people in that area who aren't necessarily trained to think like super critically as kind of like scientists around this kind of stuff. And I say that realizing that also includes a lot of scientists in that field. But
scientists have egos? No.
But I think there's almost a sense in which, particularly at the high level, like you don't want to be the team that's not doing it. Just in case it works, because everyone else is doing it as well. So I remember I haven't competed for years now, but I was a relatively mediocre sprinter, and I tried to get sort of like back into competing in my sort of late 20s, and then my hamstrings protested, so I decided to give that up. But when I got back into training, I was just running kind of like open meets, but I would end up down the track training at the same time. One of the local Southampton teams were training. Oftentimes, some of the athletes would come over after having run ladder drills and all sorts of random plyometric things and whatnot, and they'd sort of like chat to me and ask about what my training was, and I'd be like, I'm sprinting. So I come down here and I work on some fly sprints, and I kind of like pick up to that, and then I spend a bit of time like specifically working on my start and my reaction time and things like that, and then I cool down and I go home. Like, it's like, what are you doing? Like, are you training to run ladders? Like, I mean, if you're going to go on Takeshi's Castle or something, then maybe it'll be good. But I feel like, it was like mind blowing to them because they see everyone else doing it and they don't want to be the ones who aren't doing it. So I think there's kind of like there's the social pressures of that. What was the wording I used? I think a lot of high level athletes train the way they do because they're high level athletes. They're not high level athletes because of the way they train.
They train, 100%. Yeah, and that's what I was trying to communicate earlier too. With the don't look at what the highest level athlete, the LeBron James or anyone else, is doing and assume that you can do that and become that person. But if you see somebody like you who's like, oh, that person's pretty fast. What do? Oh, they just practice being fast. Like, oh, that makes sense. So just a quick thought there that you made me think of. Have you heard of the enhanced games?
Yes, yeah, I have. Yeah,
you might have a shot. You could just start juicing to the gills and.
Well, my controversial perspective on that is I'm skeptical of the extent to which that really is important. So I'll give you my reasoning for that. Okay. Partly because
for those of you who don't know, the enhanced games is basically the Olympics openly on steroids, because as most people know, most Olympians are on steroids. But these guys are being open about it. So.
Well, actually, it's funny. That goes back to the periodization thing as well, because a lot of one of the arguments for Eastern Bloc success during that period, a lot of the proponents of periodization will say, like, all of those successful athletes were training in a periodized fashion. And then critics will go like, yeah, but also they were on various other interventions as well, failing to realize that so were all the US athletes during that time as well. So everyone was doing it. But so I remember chatting with Jeremy Leneke about this as well, because they've obviously done a lot of interesting work, which to some extent questions the, even in very specific tasks, the role, for example, of muscle growth on strength outcomes. The causal mechanisms there, and that's a really hard question to ask. But there's certainly a lot of data that like questions whether or not that causal, muscles get bigger and that's why you get stronger. Question that causality. So if I extrapolate from that a little bit there and think like, okay, there are other effects of some of the pharmaceutical interventions that these athletes are taking. One of them being, for example, they can potentially train with higher volumes and they can practice sprinting more. But if you go purely down the kind of like, well, it's going to help them build muscle and things like that, then I start to question whether something that's technically more skill oriented, like sprinting, rather than like doing a barbell curl, I start to then question again, like, to what extent is that really happening? And the real answer is we don't know, because we don't have good quality randomized control trial evidence on this, because it's so moralized out now that no one wants to study it or anything like that, or people want to study it but no one will let people study it and stuff. So
I mean, I would be shocked if somebody broke a world record, which is like they're giving away $1 million if you break the 100-meter record or the 50-meter swimming freestyle record. But it would be interesting to me, because like my biggest thing with is not, it's with baseball, it's with any of these sports where it's like it's an open secret that we know everybody was using steroids, but it's like I couldn't take steroids and become Barry Bonds. Like, that's not going to make you a better hitter, right? It's going to make you bigger, maybe make you faster. The biggest thing to me is the training capacity, right? Like, so when I look at the periodization argument, it's all about the quantity of volume that those guys were doing and specific training, and not physically having the capacity to do that if you weren't taking EPO and you weren't taking HGH and you weren't taking, all the different steroids that they were taking, because your body physically can't handle that. You break down. So to me, I think that'll be the more interesting question, is if these people, under the guidance of doctors, can basically train themselves beyond their limits and find a way to peak at the right time. I don't know. I think there'll be some freaks. I'm excited, man. When it finally comes out, I'm excited to see it. So I'll be watching. But
I'm fairly pro it anyway. My perspective has always been, look, and this is just the I guess the libertarian side of me, which is to say like, look, none of you as athletes have got any right to compete in someone's competition that they've set up. So if someone sets up a competition and says the rules are this, you have to follow the rules, and if you don't, then that's it. So if an organization sets it up and says like, yeah, take what you want, that's fine. Like, okay, that's cool. That's fine. They could choose to not set up the organization. That so I'm it's like complaining about that is bizarre to me.
Yeah, for sure. No, I just like the transparency. Okay, well, we could go down that rabbit hole, but we will just recap and close out here. Biggest takeaways for me, James, were just, if you're an older individual and your goal is functionality, you want to be able to get yourself off the toilet till you're 100 years old. You don't need to do stupid stuff at the gym. Just train with someone who can put together a simple, well-rounded, progressively more intense full body program for you to follow. If you enjoy the functional training stuff, I know there's a lot of people I train that go to like golf clinics, they do things like that, and they enjoy that stuff. I think that's fine, but it doesn't seem to be necessary. And then the barrier for exercise for many people, besides time, is perceived in complexity. So I think as a trainer, it just behooves you, especially if you have someone that doesn't like exercise, unless they want a ton of variety, to do something that's less complicated, that people find less daunting, that they're actually going to do. So save all the cool, fancy exercises and just do something that you know is going to progressively overload them and get them results. Anything else that you think I missed from like a big picture perspective?
No, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head there. Yeah, I would just reiterate, it's training can be simpler than a lot of people think it is, and particularly for populations like older adults, keeping it safe and effective is a priority. So good recap.
If anybody wants to reach out to you, ask you some questions, what's your email, your Twitter? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
So I'm not on Twitter anymore, but probably the best way is just
I had you
via
pegged
email.
for a Twitter guy.
I was, and then Twitter. I reminisce about the old school days of like academic Twitter.
Yeah.
and don't get me wrong, like Twitter was shit before Musk bought it. Like it was going downhill, and the quality of conversation on there and whatnot. But yeah, so I'm loosely on a few different social media platforms, but probably the best way to get in contact with me is via email. So it's James at Steele-research.com.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, man. I really appreciate your time. It's been really good to catch up with you, and you're always so insightful on what's going on with the research. So keep doing what you're doing. I'm really excited to see that GLP study. Hopefully that all comes together, because I think that would just be great for the industry as a whole. So thanks everyone for listening. Thanks, James, for joining us, and we will see you all again soon.